May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So this parable has been labeled the Good Samaritan. And we've got lots of hospitals with Good Samaritan in their names. And the Good Samaritan law to protect any do-gooders with no medical training from civil liability if they render aid at the scene of an accident. The term Good Samaritan has become synonymous with just about any compassionate individual aiding a stranger. Amy Jill Levine, a professor of New Testament and Jewish studies at Vanderbilt Divinity School and an Orthodox Jew, believes, however, that is not the message a first-century Jewish audience would have heard. For them, this parable would not have been simply about caring for a fellow human being. And it is not an answer to the question, who is my neighbor? It is much more provocative than that. And parables are meant to challenge us to look more closely at the hidden aspects of our values, our lives. Levine notes, to get an initial hint of the distance between the mindset of the parable's original audience and our own 21st century perspectives, we might begin by reflecting briefly on the term Good Samaritan. Today, we use the term as if it were not peculiar. Yet, as far as I am aware, she says, there are no good Catholic or good Baptist hospitals. To label the Samaritan, any Samaritan, a good Samaritan should be, in today's climate, seen as offensive. It is tantamount to saying, she reflects, he's a good Muslim, or she's a good immigrant, as opposed to all those other Muslims or immigrants who are not. But what happens when we strip away 2,000 years of usually benevolent and well-intended domestication, and here the parable is a first-century short story spoken by a Jew to other Jews? Jesus tells the parable of the Samaritan in response to a lawyer's question, who is my neighbor? And one could argue that in looking at the law, one needs to know who are neighbors and who are not. But asking, who is my neighbor, can also be seen as a polite way of asking, who is not my neighbor, or who does not deserve my love, or whose lack of food or shelter can I ignore? And Jesus' answer, no one. Everyone deserves that love. As Professor Levine points out, in Jewish thought, one was called to care for the stranger, and one could not mistreat the enemy, but love was not mandated. Proverbs 25:21 insists, if your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat. And if they are thirsty, give them water to drink. But it is only Jesus who insists, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The traveler in the parable is stripped, beaten, and left half dead. And the claim is often made that the priest and the Levite perhaps passed by the beaten man on the other side of the road because they are afraid of being contaminated by touching a corpse or so violating purity laws. But Professor Levine explains that there is nothing impure about touching a person who is half dead, nor is there any sin involved in burying a corpse. To the contrary, the Torah expects corpses to be interred. Rather, the law requires that both men attend to the stripped and beaten man, whether alive or dead. And looking at the refusal of the priest and the Levite to come to the aid of this man, Martin Luther King Jr. preached, "I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me. It's possible these men were afraid." And so the first question that the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by, and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? And King went on, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? And King, as we know, then went on to Memphis to help those sanitation workers and was assassinated. Bandits remain on the road to this day. For many of us today, it is the Samaritan's compassion that is key here. But to understand the parable as its original audience did, Professor Levine believes we need to think of Samaritans less as oppressed but benevolent figures, and more as they were seen as the enemy, as those who were doing the oppressing. As the Bible recounts, the Samaritan people originated after the 12-tribe united monarchy ruled by David and Solomon split into two independent states. And through various twists throughout their history, by Jesus' time, there was no love lost between the Jews and the Samaritans. And from the perspective of the stripped and beaten man left on the side of the road, Jewish listeners might have thought, I would rather die than acknowledge that one from that group saved me. And even the lawyer is unable here to voice the hated name Samaritan. He can only say, the one who showed him mercy. As a professor of New Testament and Jewish studies, and as an Orthodox Jew, Professor Levine sees this as one of the few texts that makes an almost perfect translation to situations in our world today. Samaria today is known by various names: the West Bank, occupied Palestine, and she reflects that we only need to update the identity of the figures. In 2014, she proposed one translation. She proposes, I am an Israeli Jew on my way from Jerusalem to Jericho, and I am attacked by thieves, beaten, stripped, robbed, and left half dead in a ditch. And two people who should have stopped to help passed me by. The first, a Jewish medic from the Israel Defense Forces. The second, a member of the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church, USA. But the person who takes compassion on me and shows me mercy is a Palestinian Muslim whose sympathies lie with Hamas. Were Jesus a Samaritan today, we would have the parable of the good Jew told in the streets of Ramallah, she proposes. That was her translation in 2014, and I believe it can still stand today. And my question from myself for each and every one of us is, what would the identities of these figures be for me, for each of us today? And when I ask myself, would I come to the aid of one with whom I might totally disagree, I would like to think in my best self that I would. But I also have to admit that I have even censored myself here, for I can't even name any of those names of those groups for me. I don't even want to give any legitimacy, any airtime, or any sound bites to any of those groups. And the other big question, can I even imagine that one of them would even come to my aid? Last Sunday, we talked about the challenging and holy work of listening to and having conversations with those who might see things very, very differently than we do. And as difficult as that might be, those conversations are critical. Critical for any possibility of moving forward, and done one conversation at a time. Jesus came so that we might have life and have it abundantly. And he insists that we must love our neighbors and our enemies. The Samaritan acts with the mercy and the love of God. And so Jesus charges each and every one of us, go and do likewise. Amen.